While traveling down the road at night, sometimes tired eyes can see things that aren't actually there. Shadows dancing just beyond the streetlights, creatures of all kinds bounding into and out of the darkness, and on occasion, the lone figure of a late-night wanderer. For those compassionate enough or perhaps brave enough to stop their car and offer help or even a ride to those in need, sometimes those experiences can be fairly rewarding. Others can be outright weird. For those driving down the A229 highway through the county of Kent in England, the experience might be less rewarding or weird, but rather utterly horrifying. Join me in this episode as we delve into the story behind the vanishing hitchhiker said to haunt BlueBell Hill. Welcome back to Moonlight Lore, everyone. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins. In this episode, we are delving into the mysterious sightings of a ghostly hitchhiker said to haunt the A229 highway near BlueBell Hill. It's been happening for several decades now. Those driving near BlueBell Hill have often reported seeing a young woman walking along the side of the road, looking as if she is distressed and needing help. According to legend, for those worried she might be in a dire situation or are compassionate enough to offer her a ride to where she's heading, usually find themselves face to face with a young, pale woman looking tired and despondent. She claims she's either looking for her friends, she had been in a car crash just up the road, on her way to a wedding, or simply doesn't say anything at all. Of course, being good Samaritans, many people offer up a ride to the stranded woman and allow her to enter their vehicle where she typically likes to take a seat in the back, allowing the driver to have a full view of her through the rearview mirror. As the car begins to move, and as the driver, typically a lone male, carries on their way down the road, they ask where the young girl is heading, to which she usually provides an address not too far from where she had been picked up. After a few quick minutes of driving, the driver has usually been said to try and strike up a short conversation with their new ride-along, but only ever getting one-word responses or nothing at all, making the quick trip an eerily quiet one. Perhaps it's out of awkwardness from the silence or concern for the well-being of their new passenger, but the drivers usually try and take a look through the mirror to check in on them. But upon doing so, when they look in the back through the mirror, they see nothing but an empty seat behind them, with their new passenger having completely disappeared. Obviously, this would unnerve anyone, but now armed with an address given to them by the vanishing hitchhiker, the driver would head to the address and meet with the person who answered the door. They would tell whoever it was who answered the door that they had picked someone up who claimed to have lived at the address, and after listening to their story, the current occupant of the home would offer them some comfort in the form of a pat on the shoulder and say the girl used to live there, but died in a fatal car accident quite a few years prior. Over the years, this same exact experience along with similar sightings have been reported over and over again, usually happening on the same date, causing major national newspapers and online articles to talk about the ghost of BlueBell Hill. Other run-ins commuters have had with the ghost of BlueBell Hill include seeing a woman bounding out from the side of the road, making steady eye contact with unnerved drivers, and jumping in front of their vehicles, only to be hit, fall under the car, or go flying off upon making impact with it. When the driver quickly pulls over and gets out to check, no body of a woman is ever found, and no sign of impact on the vehicle can be seen despite many people reporting on hearing the obvious sounds of running into something. Reports similar to these hauntings on the A229 near BlueBell Hill have been happening for so long, even back in the late 60s, people were reporting seeing something strange in their neighborhood. And although there are some who believe these ghost stories are nothing more than just tales people like to share to give a quick fright to those superstitious enough to listen, the fact is, the origin of all these stories is all but a tragic reality of the past. If we go back to November 19th of 1965, it was a Friday night and 4 young women were out driving in their Ford Katina, celebrating the start of an eventful weekend. One of the women in the car was soon to be married in just a few hours. 22-year-old Susan Brown was set to marry Brian Wetton the following morning, and her 3 bridesmaids were heading home after a night of celebration. Upon nearing the bridge at Old Chatham Road, the girls speeding down the highway in their Ford and a 1950s Jaguar coming from the other direction both came to an immediate stop as the two collided with each other head-on. It's not clear who might have been at fault, but at this point it didn't matter. The damage was done, and all the occupants of both vehicles were in complete disarray. It took some time before help arrived, and unfortunately the ambulances got there too late for Judith Lingham, one of the 4 girls who had been in the Ford Katina. She was the only one to die on the scene. But the death wouldn't stop there. Both the bride-to-be, Susan Brown, and another one of the bridesmaids, Patricia Ferguson, later died at Maidstone Hospital a few days later. This horrific accident didn't take long to make it onto the front news of papers the next day once word had gotten out, and soon enough, the crash became the source of gossip for all the nearby villages and towns in the area. Just a few days after the collision, those who would drive down the road late at night mentioned seeing a figure on the side of the road, but it was too dark to be certain, but also felt the constant watch of eyes on them while driving past the location of the crash. As time went on, more and more sightings of a ghostly figure walking or standing on the side of the road became more frequent. But on occasion, there wasn't just one. Some drivers passing through the area would sometimes report seeing 2 young women walking down the road together, only to disappear as the car gets closer. In a rare incident back in 1969, 4 years after the event of the crash, a man on his way home to Rochester spotted 2 pedestrians appearing out of thin air crossing the road. With no time to act, he braced for impact as his car collided with the pair. But his horrifying stare quickly turned to confusion as the 2 figures didn't collide with his vehicle, but rather passed right through it. He got out, and after a thorough search around his vehicle and down the road, he couldn't find any sign of the 2 people he supposedly ran into. In what is probably known as the most famous sighting of the ghost bride of BlueBell Hill, comes to us from a man named Maurice Goodenough back in 1974. Maurice was a bricklayer at the time and was heading to his job early in the calm morning of July 13th. As he traveled down the A229 getting closer to BlueBell Hill area, all of a sudden a young woman jumped out in front of his truck, making contact with it, creating a loud thud. Maurice swore he hadn't seen the woman before just seconds upon hitting her, and claimed she had just materialized out of thin air right in front of his eyes. And completely sure his eyes and ears weren't playing tricks on him, Maurice slammed on the brakes of his truck and quickly jumped out to check on the poor woman he was so certain he had just hit. The girl was lying motionless on the pavement at the side of the road with grazed knees and a large cut to her forehead. As Maurice tried his best to get a response from the young woman, he knew he would need help from others to move her to his truck to take to the hospital. He began trying to wave down a few vehicles passing by, but as it was early in the morning still, there was little traffic. Even so, nobody would stop to help or even slow down. Feeling a bit of defeat, Maurice rushed back to the girl and placed a blanket he got from his truck on top of her to at least shield her from the cold morning air and hopefully provide something visible for the other drivers to see so they wouldn't hit her. Kneeling down, he promised he would come back to the unconscious woman and raced off to get some help. He headed straight towards the closest police station, and upon entering, his urgent explanation and worried look was enough to convince the officers there at the station to believe he had indeed hit a woman on the road and followed Maurice to the location near BlueBell Hill where he claimed to have struck the woman. As the officers and Maurice returned to the scene, Maurice was shocked to see not only was the woman who he had seriously injured with his car was missing, but all that was left was the blanket he had used to cover her. Still convinced Maurice was telling the truth though, the police conducted a massive search for the missing and injured girl immediately. For the entire day, the police searched up and down the A229 highway. With the help of a few volunteers but no sign of her and night quickly approaching, they decided to call off their search until dawn. By morning, the officers were out there again in full force and had called in for a bit of help from the nearby towns where they were able to obtain more officers for the search and also a few search dogs to assist them. Unfortunately though, the canines weren't able to find any scent of the lost woman, and the officers weren't able to find any traces of blood or signs of footprints in the dirt. A few officers checked nearby hospital admissions in hopes perhaps the woman had checked in, but no files showing a woman of that supposed age and appearance checked in during the time between Maurice hitting her with his vehicle and the search. They then put out word with a local newspaper in hopes someone had a run-in with this woman or at least seen where she may have disappeared to. But with no tips coming in from the public and no evidence being turned up, the police were forced to end their search for the injured woman. Now, one might think, well, this obviously sounds like another ghost sighting near BlueBell Hill. And once the press got word of the story, they took no time to connect this incident with the 1965 car crash that took the lives of 3 young girls near that same spot. With the fact a young woman was hit near the same area of the crash, then vanishing after being hit and leaving no mark or dent in Maurice's truck, all led many to believe this was a genuine ghost sighting. Maurice was then interviewed the following Saturday after the incident by News of the World tabloid, where he was reportedly still incredibly troubled by the incident, saying, "I'm not going mad, but where did she vanish to? I'm still shaking from the experience." In a newspaper article coming out in 1992, around the anniversary of the crash, Ian Sharp, a 54-year-old bus driver, was heading home after a long shift during a chilly November Sunday night when suddenly he spotted a young woman seemingly materializing out of thin air right in front of his vehicle. The eerie part is when he was fast approaching her, she stood completely still, making eye contact with him the entire time before he hit her, with her body falling under the bus. Completely terrified he had just killed someone, Ian slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the bus to quickly check on the poor woman he had just ran over. In an interview done shortly after the incident, Ian is quoted saying, "I honestly thought I had killed her. You can't imagine how it felt. I was so scared to look underneath, but I knelt down and looked straight through, but there was nothing there." And now getting up off of the pavement, thinking perhaps he had traveled a bit further from the point of where he had hit her before, he quickly rushed behind the bus, and upon finding nothing there, he walked around the sides of the road thinking she had somehow gotten thrown off to the side where he would find her there. But still there was nothing. But Ian was so certain he had hit someone, and without finding any body, he rushed to the police station located at Rochester to report what he saw and what he did. The officers there did their best to calm him. By this point they had heard many similar stories happening on that road, but nonetheless, they accompanied him back to the location he said he had hit the woman. After searching the area, the police returned to a still shaken Ian to inform him that there was in fact no body or sign of one being hit anywhere near the tire marks he had left on the road, and shared with him the legend of what happened on that spot decades earlier and the similar reported sightings others have had. Later, while recounting the horrifying experience, Ian is quoted saying, "It was the most terrifying experience of his life." The ghost of BlueBell Hill has become one of the most famous ghost stories to have come out of Kent, as the sightings of the Ghost Bride have persisted for the past 56 years to the present day, with some still saying they witnessed the ghost on their commutes. While these sightings have been increasingly difficult to narrow down to a specific person, we are left with the previous, more famous stories that help make up the legend and allow it to grow to as large as it's become. In fact, the ghost of BlueBell Hill has grown so much interest. Back in 2014, a woman by the name of Sonia Roseman released a movie based off the ghost of BlueBell Hill. During the production and filming of the movie, the workers involved were fearful of the possible repercussions of filming on the location of such a tragic accident. For example, according to the film crew, just 2 days before they began filming, a motorist lost control of his bike and crashed where the crew were about to film at. Then Sonia's flat burnt down, destroying everything except for a few pictures. People in the community began to fear that the added attention the ghost was getting on its anniversary was starting to cause these strange and very dangerous happenings around the area. Then, a year later in 2015, and on the 50th anniversary of the crash in 1965, believers in the ghostly legend and a paranormal investigation team headed to the site of the crash to do some investigating, and apparently some have said is that they were able to capture and pick up recordings of strange voices calling out for help and the occasional scream coming from nowhere. It would seem, even over 50 years later, the ghost bride of BlueBell Hill remains quite present. There have been some, though, who disagree on the identity of the ghost too, of course. Instead of Susan Brown, the bride-to-be, haunting the road, many believe it's actually Judith Lingham, the one who actually died on the road back in '65, who is haunting the A229. But of course, with it being one of the more famous ghost stories ever to come out of the United Kingdom, we still may never know the true identity of the ghost. There are those who claim they have seen it in a white dress, symbolizing Susan Brown's wedding dress. Others have said the ghost resembling a young woman in her teens. And there have been some that even said they had spotted the hitchhiking ghost off of the A229 nearby the Lower Bell pub, where believers like to gather in hopes of spotting the ghost themselves. And although some may claim to see it, and others may never see it, the hitchhiking ghost of BlueBell Hill is the type of story people from all around the world are familiar with. From different cities and towns all across the world, hitchhiking ghosts are found everywhere. The Niles Canyon ghost is one of a young girl who passed away in a car accident on the 680 freeway in California, and supposedly every February 28th, the date of her death, she walks along the road asking drivers who stop for her to take her to her home in San Francisco, but disappears from the vehicle once the driver begins to cross a nearby bridge. On the N9 road in South Africa, a young girl named Marie Charlotte Rowe died in a violent road accident on April 12th of 1968. According to locals who drive this stretch of road where the accident occurred, every year on the anniversary of her death, Marie Charlotte returns to hitchhike on the road she was killed on, only to vanish a short time after being picked up. Then there's the Tuen Mun Road in Hong Kong. It's a major expressway used by hundreds every day. Due to the many vehicles driving it, the expressway has seen its fair share of vehicle accidents and the occasional death caused by them. Many people believe the road itself is haunted by those who have passed in these crashes, as sudden appearances of ghostly figures appearing in the middle of the road have caused even further accidents to occur. There are literally hundreds of these types of cases of hitchhiking phantoms dotting the planet, which honestly would probably make a pretty decent episode, so I may do that in the future, compiling a bunch of these stories and sightings into one episode. But the fact that nearly every other vanishing hitchhiker case around the world involves a car accident causing someone to pass away, and then someone reporting later on seeing the figure of the person who had passed away on the anniversary of their death in the same location, adds to the credibility the ghost bride of BlueBell Hill being an actual ghost, if we consider the tragic past the A229 has. But, as always, I'll leave it up to you, the listener, if you believe the ghost of BlueBell Hill is a true ghost story, or if it was just created by those who wanted to create a spooky story out of a tragic past. Personally, I find it a bit suspicious that finding someone who has seen the ghost on A229 is fairly difficult, and how we really only have a few short stories about the ghost coming from a few individuals. However, for being one of the more famous ghost stories in the United Kingdom, it has to have some credence to some of the claims, I feel. So I'm a bit torn. The ghost could be real, but it also might not be. We just have to simply rely on the claims of those nameless individuals who share their stories over the internet about it. But like I said, the tragic past of the road definitely can add a bit of weight to the claims if we consider other cases of vanishing hitchhikers around the world. Those traveling the A229 road near BlueBell Hill will just have to continue to drive safely and keep their eyes open for any strange figures with outstretched arms, signaling for a ride from anyone willing to take the risk to chauffeur the dead to their next destination. Thanks for listening to my episode about the ghost bride of BlueBell Hill. If you liked it, consider leaving a 5-star review on iTunes and share the podcast with your friends and family to help grow the podcast and bring more people into the world of the paranormal. If you have a recommendation on an episode, had a paranormal experience of your own, or simply just want to say hi, feel free to contact me through email at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com or follow the podcast on Instagram at Moonlight Lore Podcast. I'd love to hear from you. But until next time, keep your lanterns lit, and keep exploring the unknown.